Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum. I am Sohaib Saeed, this person here. And I want to give you a brief tour, as brief as I can, of my most recent academic publication in the Journal of Quranic Studies. It's called Fights and Flights, Two Underrated Alternatives to Dominant Readings in Tafsīr. So I want to make this paper, which is in an academic journal, more accessible to a general readership, especially Muslims who are interested in what I have to say about tafsir and a couple of ayahs of the Quran, in which there are some interesting alternative opinions to what you may have heard or understood before, especially through reading translations of the Quran and even in tafsirs of the Quran. So let's start by mentioning about the journal. The Journal of Quranic Studies has been around for a good few years, since 1999. A very short description here, which actually I hadn't noticed before, but I think is really nice, is that it promotes the study of Quran from a wide range of scholarly perspectives, and the journal bridges the gap between the two traditions of Muslim and Western scholarship. So while that is linked to the fact that it is in these two languages, English and Arabic, even in the English language, there is a possibility of bridging that gap. And my paper, I feel, really fits into this kind of aim. So this is published by a team based at the mostly at SOAS. So if you see the editorial board, the chief editor is Professor Abdul Halim, who was my PhD supervisor, in fact, and famous for his translation of the Quran. Various others who are based at SOAS, and then editorial advisors from around the world, including famous Egyptian and Azhari scholars, amongst various academic perspectives and people who have published widely, and whom I cite in my work as well. Something which I'm quite proud of, if I'm allowed to be that, is that among the most read papers is mine. It seems to be the second most read at the moment. Of course, anything to do with Ayatul Darb is going to attract a lot of attention. But even though it's only been about a month since it came out, my paper has become amongst the most read. So if you click on it, or if you click under volume 24, you get to this issue, and this is the abstract or the summary of my paper, or the topic of it. So I'm talking here about this one, ayah 178 of Surah Al-Baqarah, and also 260. The first of them is commonly taken to legislate Qisas in the meaning of retaliation for murder. And also the Ibrahim and the birds verse, it is generally understood to tell us about a command in which Ibrahim, having asked God, how do you give life to the dead, is told to chop up some birds. So this paper examines two cases in which a dominant view in Muslim exegesis has existed alongside an alternative. So I'm going to go through the introduction before we get to each of these two case studies, and each of them, I go into quite a lot of depth, but I'll give you an idea about what's coming up here. So that alternative, which I'll talk about in due course, is minimized or criticized. And minimized can mean it's simply ignored, and most of the Mufassirin don't mention it. They may not even have been aware of it, or they just considered it not worthy of bringing up. Or if they brought it up, then they also offered criticisms. That's especially the case in the alternative that's given to the birds verse. So, arguably, and this is what I'm arguing in the paper, each of these alternatives is a closer fit to the text and context of the verse. So I'm not setting out to say that the commonplace view is wrong or condemnable or anything like that, but I want to make a strong case for these alternatives because I believe that they actually help us to understand the ayahs even better. So the first reading, alternative reading, is of the Qisas verse, and the main figure that we're going to talk about in that is Ibn Taymiyya rahimahullah. And what's interesting about the history of that view is that there's very little mention of it before him, and even less mention of it after him. So it's kind of perplexing, but we can talk also about some reasons, which I talk about in the paper. And then we've got the alternative reading of the birds verse, in which the birds aren't supposed to be chopped. That isn't the point. And this is advanced by someone earlier than Ibn Taymiyya, who's called Abū Muslim al-Iṣfahānī, from the Mu'tazila. And this alternative view has actually been picked up by some modern exegetes and translators, but for the most part has been dismissed for these various reasons. So I'm going to chart the reception of these views, and I'm going to analyze them phrase by phrase and make my arguments for the alternatives. So if you're coming to read this on the site, you can click for the PDF. That will open up a new window. You get this little coffee symbol, and then you can get to the paper. So this gives you the kind of, let's see, how do I zoom out from this? But anyway, this gives you the layout as it's published in the journal. So that is, in some ways superior, of course. But one of the drawbacks of this is that when you've got the footnotes, they are not footnotes in the printed edition, they are endnotes. So that means if you want to see what I'm saying below the line, you really have to go right down to the end, and then you've got the endnotes. So that is usually, most people find that a bit tiresome, but there's different points of view. What is good about the PDF version also is that you can see the tables. There's two very important tables which we're going to look at, and they do look better in the PDF than they do in the online text. But the online text is what we're going to go through, because this is going to be easier for us to navigate between the main text and the footnotes. Because a lot of what I'm doing in this paper really is happening in the footnotes. There is, it's not just references, but I'm saying a lot of things there that I do want to draw attention to as we go through. So when we get into the paper itself, I've got an introduction, which is, I don't know, what's this, 7 paragraphs or so. And this is just laying out what I want you to understand about tafsir, and what I want you to get about how I see tafsir, right? So right from the beginning, I'm saying that the genre of tafsir is one in which analysis, transmission, debate, and selection play their intertwining roles. So if we just click like this, that's just some people that I'm thanking. So this is worth reading, and of course I'm not going to read through every word of this paper, just to give you an idea about what the topics are and some main points that I want you to notice. So one of the things that is coming up here is the issue of ijma', because this is going to become important in the points that I'm making. Because when I'm saying that there's an alternative view, then this alternative view is competing with an extremely dominant view, right? So when I say dominant readings, it could even be to the extent that it is claimed to be ijma', it is claimed to be consensus. Of course, there's always something slightly paradoxical about saying such and such opinion contradicts consensus, because the fact that alternative view exists means that the consensus is not absolute. But we could say consensus among those whom we consider worthy of being counted, right? So the idea that you can just come along late in the game and say, well, actually, this is the correct view and everybody before me is wrong, naturally is problematic from a Muslim perspective. So I talk here about the issue of tafsir bil-ma'thur and tafsir bil-ra'i, and I don't want to accept this binary as such, but it is helpful to a point that I'm making to bring that up. I also bring up here an earlier paper of mine. I'll give links to these things, inshallah, in the description of the video. So the earlier paper, the Shaheen Affair, was talking about an alternative reading and approach to ayat which are talking about the creation of Adam alayhi salam and things related to evolution, where Abdul Sabur Shaheen was arguing that the Quran can be read as consistent with a type of human evolution. So there are people who nowadays come along with these novel views, But there are also, people who did this many centuries ago. So when they did that, um, do we accept it when they came up with a novel view in the first few centuries? So Abū Muslim died in 322 of the Hijrah, so a 4th century or even earlier opinion. Is it okay then to come up with something new? And in reality, as the question that's going to come up here, is that necessarily new? Do we know for sure that nobody before Abū Muslim saw the ayah in the way that he saw it, or merely that his is the earliest expression of that view that we can find in our recorded history? The issue of shadh opinions I talk about here. It's a term that's been used, but maybe not the clearest term that could be used for these alternatives as such. There is a category of oddities, if you like in al-Itqān fi ulūm al-Qur'an has a chapter called Gharaib al-Tafsīr. And interesting, Abū Muslim himself has this very nice quote, where he says regarding a view about the opening letters of Surah Ash-Shura. He says, I only shared this so it may be known that some who claim knowledge are idiots. أَنَّ مِمَّنْ يَدَّعِ الْعِلْمَ حَمْقًا. Right? So there is room for saying that because something is very strange opinion, it's odd and therefore should be rejected. But the fact of it being kind of unusual or isolated or not common is not itself the problem, right? So I talk here about al-Fakhr al-Razi. Of course, many of you know I have a particular relationship with his work as a translator of the great exegesis. And this criticism has been made of him to commonly quote at length views that he doesn't actually agree with. And that might be what's happening here, because as you'll see, most people who know about Abū Muslim's view on the bird's verse get it from the tafsir of Fakhruddin al-Razi. But I actually have a slightly original view about this. For the most part, I think it's understood that al-Razi disagreed with Abū Muslim on this verse. But as you'll see in the paper, I argued that it's not so clear that he was disagreeing with Abū Muslim. He quoted some arguments against, but as for his own position, it's not made explicit. So I bring up the concept of mushkil exegesis, that is to say, ayat which have been found challenging by the exegetes themselves. And that goes in contrast with those who insist that the Quran is clear, the Quran is easy. Yes, those terms are used in certain ayat and so on, that the Quran is mubin. But what does that mean? It certainly can't mean that everything is clearly and easily understood in the Quran by everyone. That cannot be the case, because even the expert mufassirin would tell us about certain passages. Take, for example, this one near the end of Surah Al-Ma'idah, that this is ashkalu ayatin fil Quran, the most tricky. The word problematic can be used here if we understand it correctly, in terms of meaning, in terms of syntax, in terms of rulings, and so on. So they use words like ashkal ayah or a'dal or as'ab or a'was, all of which get towards the same idea. So that's to say that when we come to these ayahs, especially the first one, which is about qisāṣ, I want it to be known that the mufassirin themselves felt that there were some challenges and difficulties in understanding and interpreting it. So when someone comes along later, such as Ibn Taymiyya, it can be understood that what they're doing is actually solving some of those problems. And if they solve those problems by offering an alternative reading, then they should be thanked rather than told, oh, you have broken ijma'. Right, so this is just a few points made in the footnotes. So how I'm looking at tafsir, the purpose of tafsir and the nature of it is that the mufassirin assume that there is a meaning that exists independent of the interpretations given by the mufassirin. And so the task of tafsir is to get to that meaning, right? So this is just some more details around this. I don't want to get into too much depth about this at the moment. And also the concept of zahir comes up a number of times in this paper, where something is argued to be the plain sense meaning or the apparent meaning or the outward meaning or the most evident or most obvious meaning of a verse. And that is something that's related to language. So the language itself seems to say something. That's the zahir. And as we'll see, there are certain things in these particular cases where certain mufassirin are saying that this is a zahir, but I'm going to point out how it's not so zahir after all. And sometimes the alternative is more obvious. But there are other factors which have led people to turn away from what was more obvious to something which they found more acceptable. Some discussion about sources on zahir, some discussion about tarjih and selecting between different possibilities in tafsir, the use of the concept of mutashabih. And yes, the word muhtamal is useful here in the sense that something which is a possible reading is somehow carried by the text. So it's almost like those people who came along later and said, well, this I think is the real meaning. They're saying that they're finding it in the text. They're not inventing that meaning, but they are finding it. That's the way that they would see it themselves. So in the modern times, you get more intervention of ra'i, or things that are more seem to be, in novel opinion and reformist approaches in tafsir. But as I was saying a bit before, it has always been the case that new interpretations pop up along the way. So we talk about the two case studies here, so we can get straight into the first of these. So this is Ayatul Qisas. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu kutiba alaykum al-qiṣāṣ fi al-qatla. Here in this translation, I've left it untranslated. This is Mufti Taqi Usmani's translation, so I chose it partly because he left the word qisas like that, in order not to jump to exactly what qisas is. But for the most part, qisas has been understood, and another term for it in the Arabic language is qawad, which is retaliation, a punishment that matches the crime committed. Specifically, because fil qatla, specifically here in this ayah, it is understood to mean for murder, qatl al-amd, which is deliberate killing, then qisas is to be exacted upon the perpetrator, right? So this is Mufti Taqi, right? So something that I point out here is all translations fit this general mold, okay? And I say that in terms of what I've seen in the English language and what I've been able to get, through certain colleagues within the Global Quran Project. And I should mention, by the way, that this paper was made open access, which means it's free for anyone to read on the internet, with the generous support of the Global Quran Project, headed by Professor Johanna Pink, and that is funded by the European Research Council. So that means that it's able to reach more people. And so I give a certain amount of attention to the issue of translation in this paper in order to respect the fact that it is, it emerged from within a project about Quran translations. So there are no translations, as far as I've been able to identify, in English or even in other languages, although I'd be happy to hear about any that do follow, but there's none that follow the alternative view, right? So the most obvious point that would be different is when it comes to فَمَنْ عُفِيَ لَهُ مِنْ أَخِيهِ شَيْءٌ, which is usually along this line: if one is somewhat forgiven by his brother. The Taymiyyan view, as we're going to see, would have a very different translation here. It would be the most obvious point of difference, but in fact the whole translation would change, and you're going to see a little bit later an adapted version of this translation. So this is the general view, although there is disagreement about some of the specifics of interpretation. What's shared is the understanding of what qisas is. It makes sense to say, Qisas has been prescribed for you when it comes to murdered people. The freeman for the freeman. So it's understood the freeman will be killed for the freeman. That is, the guilty freeman who committed murder will be killed for the freeman that he killed, right? The slave or the enslaved person, as it's better to say, but this is the it's normal to say slave as well at the current time in many translations. So the slave for the slave, a guilty one who's committed murder will be killed for or due to the slave that he killed, and the female for the female likewise. So already you might see what the issue is here of interpretation. Is it limited to these categories? Like a freeman is only killed for murdering another freeman, the slave only for another slave, a female only for another female. What if a female kills a male, for example? What if a freeman kills a slave, or a slave kills a freeman or a woman, right? So there are questions that come up from this translation, but it's not the translation itself that's the issue, but the interpretation that underpins it. So they need to put in this kind of gloss, something like that. The freeman will be killed for the freeman. The alternative reading is that all of this is not about killing for killing. It's not about retaliation. It is about bloodwit, diya. So generally, the diya is understood as something that comes up here to pursue the former for blood money, right? But the alternative view says, actually, the whole thing is about diya. So we're going to see how that works shortly, inshallah. And both of these views are based upon particular reports of sabab nuzul, but they're based on different reports of sabab nuzul. Okay, so we're going to talk a lot about Ibn Taymiyya. In this footnote, I talk about the question of whether Ibn Taymiyya should be seen as a mufassir, and some of the other literature about that question. His reading, although as I'm going to show you, is not original to him. He actually finds it among some predecessors. It is a kind of historicist reading. What does historicist mean? It means like reading it within as something which is embedded within its history and not as a general rule. However, he does do some generalization from it, or he does extrapolate rulings from it. So it is taken to deal with a particular situation that arose for the nascent Muslim society in Medina. And this view goes back to several Kufan successors, Tabi'een, although it's with Ibn Taymiyyah that we have it as a full fleshed out account, right? And that comes in the collection which is known as Majmu' al-Fatawa. Talk a little bit about the sources that we can use for this opinion. And what's interesting is that it's not a hidden view. It's not, Majmu' al-Fatawa is widely distributed, it's widely read. And yet this view of his really does not get any attention, very, very little attention. There's one book that I came across it in, which led me to Majmu' al-Fatawa. But for the most part, it's not coming up in works of tafsir. It's not coming up even amongst discussions by the most ardent supporters of Ibn Taymiyyah, including in terms of exegetical writers. So we'll talk about that a bit later. So he attributes it to Ash-Sha'bi and others, as mentioned by At-Tabari and others. So I won't get into the full depth here, but I talk first about how this looks in At-Tabari, how there are certain things that make it a little bit hard to discern exactly what is being said. But the materials basically for Ibn Taymiyyah's interpretation are there in At-Tabari, and they come from three tabi'in in particular: As-Suddi, Ash-Sha'bi, and Abu Malik. So let's see in the footnotes anything important. Oh, I need to avoid clicking that thing because it takes me back to the top of the page. Right. Okay, so I'm just quoting a little bit from what's being said. Okay. So if we see this quote here, that helps to make clear the point. That was specifically concerning widespread fighting, qitāl ʻimmiya or ummiya, I think both are correct. If a slave was killed from this group and another slave from that group, they would balance out. Takafa'a. And the same applied to two women and to two free men. That is its meaning, God willing. So this is not about enacting or exacting retribution and retaliation by killing the killer. Rather, it is about cancelling out the widespread losses on both sides. Okay. So then, okay, these are just references to Tabari. Okay, من بقي له من دية أخيه شيء أو من أرش جراحته فليتبع بمعروف. So we're going to see all of this in a bit more depth when we look at the table. So Ibn Kathir. Ibn Kathir is interesting because, of course, Ibn Kathir is a student of Ibn Taymiyya, but Ibn Kathir does not mention Ibn Taymiyya's view. It's very strange. He does give some narrations for the context, the sabab nuzul, but he doesn't mention this context, right? He doesn't mention the one that we have from Ash-Sha'bi. So it's not to say that Ibn Kathir has to follow Ibn Taymiyyah, but it's just interesting that he seems to be unaware or consider it unworthy of mention. Okay. I mentioned here, by the way, one of the important sources that I used, Al-Jami' al-Tarikhi. If you go to mubdi'.com, that is a very useful resource to look at tafsirs in a chronological way for a particular verse. So that proved invaluable in terms of going through and trying to find what is being said by, we cannot say all the mufassirin, but pretty much all that are currently available in digital format. And then with the issue of context, also I've mentioned here some of the Western discussions around this law in the Quran. And so you can read that if interested. Then there's this report, which is the most extensive one in the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shaybah. And here, one of the two Arab clans had been fighting. Some have said this is Aus and Khazraj, by the way. They suffered loss of life. One of the two said, "We will not be satisfied until we have killed a man for each of our women and 2 men for each of our men." The other party refused, so they referred the matter to the Prophet ﷺ, who said the killing is bawa, which means sawa. So it's all around. Everybody, people there are losses on both sides. So it's not that there's one aggressor and then the other victim. One tribe has invaded another, and therefore we have to retaliate against the aggressor. They have been doing this to each other for a long time, and there's so much loss. So instead of having more bloodshed, this alternative is, let's settle it by counting the losses on both sides. And there is a difference between these categories: a free man, an enslaved man, and then free women as well as another category. So by cancelling these out against each other, there will be a saving of lives, right? And that, as we're going to see, it gives a stronger meaning then to وَلَكُمْ فِي الْقِصَاصِ حَيَاةٌ يَا أُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. So they determined, this is all from the report in the Musannaf, the respective amounts for men, women, and enslaved people, then cancelled the blood widths of one clan against the other. And this is the meaning of this ayah. Sufyan said, فَمَنْ عُفِيَ means that whoever has excess owed to him by his brother, فَضَلَ لَهُ عَلَى أَخِيهِ, then the latter should pay it appropriately. So brother here would seem to mean something like your counterpart from the other tribe. So that part is perhaps the least clear aspect of this alternative, but many other parts come through very clearly. So this is a remarkable report because it really tells us, you know, that if we take this to be correct and authentic, that this is what happened and this is how it was applied. That really changes the whole story. So we can find this report in some subsequent works, subsequent to Al-Tabari and Ibn Abi Shayba, I mean, right? So we can find it in al-Qisāṣ, in the Ahkam al-Quran, and then some other Ahkam works. And I get the feeling that they may have taken that from al-Qisāṣ. And we can also find it in al-Qurtubi's Tafsīr. That's a major one, which comes before Ibn Taymiyya, so it's worth mentioning. But again, he's not giving that as his view. It just comes sort of, it mentions it as the fourth in a group of explanations. So one could miss it, but it is there. It is in al-Qurtubi. So there's some details about how it's mentioned in these places and how it's discussed there. But overall, this reading from Ash-Sha'bi and others was marginalized or absent from exegetical works before and then after Ibn Taymiyyah. However, when discussing this ayah, plenty was made of how difficult it was to understand. So some authors noted the difficulty making sense of the wording and reconciling with juristic positions because, as it says here, the most problematic issue, and as I say here, problematic in this particular respect, is the implication that seems to come from al-hurru bil-hurri wal-abdu bil-abdi wal-untha bil-untha, because one would seem to understand then, quite reasonably, that the same does not apply to other categories and combinations that are not mentioned. And this is called mafhum al-mukhalafa. So it implies that the free man is not killed for the slave, or vice versa. The man is not killed for the woman, and vice versa. Now, that is just simply not how most of the scholars wanted to understand the ayah. It's not how it was applied. Ibn Ashur says it like this: the scholars of Islam agreed that this implication is not adopted in full, but they differed concerning the extent to which it is applicable, right? So here I talk about a few of the different solutions, and you can go into, you can look into more detail in the works of Tafsīr. I didn't want to go into all those solutions because that's beside the point of the particular solution that's offered by just reading the ayah in a different way. This is a particularly interesting footnote. Please do give it some attention. There is a view that there was naskh, that originally the ayah was as understood to be a kind of absolute, and then it was taken at face value, but then other ayahs came to abrogate it and show that there's equality in retaliation, and that's particularly the ayah in Surah Al-Ma'idah. But this really doesn't work, and in this footnote I explain to you why, with a lot of help from Mustafa Zaid. So overall, in the works of Tafsir, there's a shared perspective that the verse is dealing directly with cases of murder and how retribution is enacted upon the murderer. Okay, but mostly this alternative does not come up. Even Ibn Taymiyyah at one point talks about it in that way, but I suggest here, what's going on in these different passages in Majmu' al-Fatawa and how they might relate to each other and why he possibly changed his view. So here's the translation that I promised. O you who believe, equitable resolution, that's a way of understanding Qisas, has been prescribed for you as regards the slain, right? The free man is offset by the free man. So here this bracket is making clear what is the understood relationship of al-hurru bil-hurri. The free man is offset by the free man, the slave by the slave, and the female by the female. Then if one has surplus over his brother, here understood as a counterpart from the other tribe, then the total blood weight, not of one person, but like if 10 more females have been killed from our tribe than your tribe, then you owe us the blood weight of 10 females, is to be pursued reasonably and is to be paid properly. All that is a relief from your Lord and a mercy, so whichever of the two groups transgresses after that by leveling further demands will have a painful punishment. So it changes the topic from being retaliation for murder or future cases of murder to a process of reconciliation between two large parties who have already suffered multiple losses, al-qatla, right? So now it's saying, instead of retaliating and then giving us a second option that you can accept blood with, it's saying collectively you must move towards blood with immediately, because we must reconcile between these two tribes, which is understood to be tribes of the Muslims. However, Ibn Taymiyyah's view is not entirely radical to the extent that he doesn't believe in the ruling of Qisas as commonly understood, or of Qawad and Nafs bin Nafs, right? But rather, it's just that he sees that as something that follows from the verse rather than being what it immediately says. Its primary meaning is this historicist kind of meaning, but its implication tells you that in cases of retaliation, it will be done like this. And then it sort of brings up the same questions that are faced by the jurists in this topic, right? As I said earlier, it is striking to note the near complete absence of the Sudi and subsequent explanations. And that even means in al-Shawkani, in Tafsīr al-Manar, Tafsīr of al-Sa'di, Ibn Uthaymeen, and of al-Qasimi. These are all people that we might have expected to pick up on it and to welcome it and to adopt it even, but they don't even mention it. And that is really remarkable. But in terms of why that's the case, it can be to do with issues of publication history. It just can simply be that although it came to be in Majmu' al-Fatawa, there was no book called Majmu' al-Fatawa until the middle of the 20th century, and it just could be that this particular passage was kind of just buried away, hidden away, and people did not have the opportunity to discuss it. So here I talk about an alternative view with Shah Waliullah. This is very interesting. I say that it bears some resemblance. That I feel I might have even overstated that. Shah Waliullah's view is actually very neat and simple and might solve the problem for the Jumhur, right? So if you don't want to take Ibn Taymiyyah's view, you could take Shah Waliullah's view and you're still with the majority, but just understanding the syntax in a different way that is much clearer. So he wants to say al-hurru bil-hurri. The ba is, and this is my paraphrasing of his point really, that the ba is along the lines of one hur is equivalent to another hur. No hur is therefore better than another or worth more than another. Al-hurru bil-hurri, wal-abdu bil-abdi, wal-untha bil-untha. So these are the three categories, but no hur is worth more than any other. No abd is worth more than any other in this respect. I mean, in the issue of enslaved people, of course, worth is something that, unfortunately, due to the nature of slavery, is attached to people. But in respect to life for life, one abd is not considered to be more valuable than another abd, right? So that is what I understand from Shah Waliullah, and it's actually very neat and very nice. But it still might suffer from certain problems that the Jumhur view suffers from, or things that make it difficult. So this is in terms of the sources. You can find it in the Persian translation. I'm not a Persian reader, but with a bit of help, I have I've seen that there. But in the Urdu translations by his very sons, it is not there, at least not clearly, and therefore it just doesn't have much of an afterlife either in the subcontinent, which is a shame. However, We do have a very different alternative which has popped up in a few works. And this is just really not an acceptable reading. It's not a viable reading in terms of the Arabic. And that is the reading that says, if a free man is guilty, then the free man. If a slave is guilty, then the slave. It's almost like this reading is based on, well, this is what the ayah should be saying, or what I understand or almost want it to be saying. Therefore, in the translation, I'll kind of make it that way. But in terms of the Arabic language, it can't be read that way. I think that Maududi got this probably from Muhammad Ali, one of the founders of Lahore Ahmadiyya, which we can find in the footnote of the English, but it is in his Urdu translation. Then we have another alternative from another person from the Ahmadiyya, from the Qadiani side, but this is also a terrible translation, completely unviable in terms of Arabic syntax. One thing to know is Farahi, Hamiduddin Farahi from the Coherent School, has said very briefly, these pairs pertain to bloodwits only. As in terms of lives, so in terms of retaliation in lives, the slave and freeman are alike. So that seems to suggest that he was of a view that is akin to Ibn Taymiyyah's. I don't suppose that he read Ibn Taymiyyah but, on this, but he could have been saying essentially the same. He might have seen this from Ash-Sha'bi and so on. But unfortunately, we just don't have the details from him because he passed away before having the opportunity to flesh out his point. What's noteworthy is that his student, and often we say that Ahsan Islahi has elaborated the views of Farahi in his Urdu commentary. Well, he just doesn't pick up on this point at all under this verse. We'll see later under the birds verse that a similar kind of thing happens, but in a different way. Ghamidi, who should also have picked up on Farahi's view, didn't. He just follows the same as what Maududi came up with, which is an unacceptable translation. It's even worse. Such that if the murderer is a free man, then the same free man should be killed in his place. The question is, whose place? In his own place? If the murderer is a free man, then the same free man should be killed in his place. And it's not there, that that is just not in the Arabic. Then we have Inayatullah Subhani, who also adheres to this school. He's a contemporary scholar. He expresses his basic agreement with Ibn Taymiyyah's position. However, he goes further in a way than Ibn Taymiyyah because he says that this is a universal ruling. So there is no such thing as Qisāṣ for him, like in the sense of retaliation. Rather, it's always settled by blood according to him. So I talk a little bit about his argument, and then I say, basically some problems with this reading, which you can look into if you're interested. I mentioned that this, I first encountered it in this book, which is called, where is the reference? It is here. Well, this is the short reference. It's called Ikhtiyarat Ibn Taymiyya fi Tafsīr, by Hindi. So the full reference is obviously at the end of the paper. So now we come to the table. And after that, I'm going to get into the sort of some specific reasons to prefer Ibn Taymiyyah's view or the alternative view. But here I get into the sort of fine details in terms of what they're saying about the words. So this, if you like, is the textual arguments. But I hope that you'll find here that I've been as fair as possible to both views. My intention is not to say one view is perfectly good, the other view is perfectly wrong, but it is to say, let's understand as well as we can each of the two views, and then we compare them, and I'll let you make your own conclusion if you feel competent to make your own conclusion. Right. So phrase by phrase, the ayah starts with Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu kutiba alaykum. So here kutiba alaykum, raises a question. So is then the qisas an obligation? It seems to address the whole community. What does it mean for it to be prescribed for them? It can be said that qisas is an institution. It's an obligation upon the community to institute it through its leadership. Others have said, well, the obligation is for the murderer. Yeah, it's maktub alayhi and yusallima nafsahu, right? To hand himself over to justice, whereas the heir has the option to take blood to it instead. Let's see a source for this. Okay, that's mentioned in it's mentioned in Hindi's book. The alternative view is, well, kutiba alaykum is speaking to the whole community. It's an obligation to be implemented immediately, right? It is to be carried out communally. It is not an issue of direct, a direct transaction between two parties, right? So that's a bit of detail that I won't go into here. Right, so then al-qisas. The word al-qisas, again, looking here at the majority view first, qasasa, the root designates cutting, and so that's one way to understand how it applies to retaliation. But if there is imbalance, then that would not fit the word qisas very well. The alternative view of it is also looking at it linguistically, but focusing more on the sense of qisas being following up. Right? That's where we get this sort of qasas, وَقَالَتْ لِأُخْتِهِ قُصِّيهِ, following up, and also equity between the two sides. So this is not a major point to focus on at the moment. Fil qatla is very interesting. Al-qisasu fil qatla. So let's start with Ibn Taymiyya's view. He's saying here that fil qatla means concerning those who have been killed. So it fits his view much more clearly. It is applied to the slain, not applied to those who will be killed one by one in the future. So al-qatla, the definite article in plural, suggests an identified group of deceased people. So these are arguments that Ibn Taymiyyah himself made, or sometimes I'm adding arguments from myself. But these are basically the kind of things that he said in support of his own view. Fil qatla, according to the Jumhur, would have to be, due to the slain, or more fully, بسبب قتل القتلى, which is more awkward than some might like to admit, right? So the true cause of retaliation is not the qatla, but the qatl al-qatla. In other words, the phrase is taken to mean in cases of murder, but then the question arises, why would it then be worded in this way in the ayah, fil qatla? It may simply be that the slain, al-qatla, are spelled out in the following phrase, bil-hurri, bil-abd, bil-untha. Okay, I don't know if that's maybe a suggestion from me or whether some of the mufassirin have said that. Al-hurru bil-hurri wal-abdu bil-abdi wal-untha bil-untha. This is the pivotal phrase, of course. Mostly it is read as, the ba is understood as like an-nafsu bin-nafs, right? So life for life, life in exchange for life, in retaliation for life. And it's natural to understand it that way because, fil qatla has been mentioned, and then we have this other verse, an-nafs bin-nafs. So it's not unreasonable at all. So the life of a free man for the life of a free man, namely the perpetrator for the victim. So then it's necessary, in order to avoid implications that are not intended, you have to look at the sabab nuzul. to understand that the point of it is, the purpose of it is to say that the penalty is only to be applied to the guilty party. So you don't kill multiple ahrar for one hur, for example, or multiple inath for one untha. But then it still remains a little bit unclear why these pairings are given of like for like. It may be to emphasize parity within each category, as no free man is valued higher than any other in this context. So that is what Shah Waliullah has said, but he said it more directly and clearly with reference to the syntax. However, the implication that boundaries of status should not be crossed is a very strong one. Al-Razi calls it muqtada al-zahir. Okay, so for Ibn Taymiyya, this phrase, the separate pairings are intended directly because they apply to bloodwit, not to retaliation. The rules of retaliation are taken from other sources or extracted by implication. So scenarios not expressed, such as an abd killing a hur, an untha killing dhakar, and so on, these are the things not mentioned. So they're extracted by implication. فَمَنْ عُرْفِيَ لَهُ مِنْ أَخِيهِ شَيْءٌ. There's a lot of variety in how this is understood. So I've summarized that here. Afu, the word ufiya has several meanings in terms of its root meanings. Most commonly, it is taken here to refer to pardoning, in which case the killer is pardoned to some extent by his brother, meaning the heir, the family of the victim, or from the blood of his brother whom he murdered, min akhihi, from the blood of his brother who's the victim. So both of these amount to the point that the heir accepts bloodwit in lieu of retaliation. Some understood afu in a different way. The afu is giving. So it's the heir who is being given the bloodwit by the killer. And the brother means brother in faith. The sense of leftover, ufiya can also mean leftover, can also be associated with the same meaning. فَمَنْ أُعْطِيَ فَمَنْ تُرِكَ لَهُ. So there's different ways of explaining that. The last word, مِنْ أَخِيهِ شَيْءٌ, شَيْءٌ مِنَ الْعَفُوِ. Right? Ibn Taymiyyah criticizes this point, and I feel that his criticism is not strong here. This point on behalf of the Jumhur is fine, as far as it seems to me. The particle in lahu, rufiya lahu, is to say the guilty party has been left off to some extent for his crime. عن ذنبه رفع له شيء من العفو. So complete afu, complete pardoning would be to say, go, you are free, and not to demand bloodwit. So bloodwit is a partial afu. Hopefully that is clear. So then, Ibn Taymiyyah's view, or the view of the other party, right? A scenario must be pictured in which there are two brothers counting on behalf of their respective tribes. I didn't find this spelled out with Ibn Taymiyyah, which is disappointing, but this is what I understand his point to be. One representative finds that he's owed something by his counterpart. If this is based on understanding afu as an amount exceeding that of his brother, this is one of the meanings of afu again. وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ مَاذَا يُنْفِقُونَ قُلِ الْعَفُ. Right? Afu is the leftover, the excess. Then the usage of min is unclear. However, it can be explained instead in terms of leftover, as Ibn Taymiyyah glosses it, بَقِيَ لَهُ مِنْ جِهَةِ أَخِيهِ شَيْءٌ. Right? So here I'm in a way trying to tidy up both sides and say, okay, this seems to be a little inconsistency in the argument as it's being made. Maybe we can slightly improve it by tweaking here and there. As others do, he understands brother in religious terms, as in Surah Al-Hujurat. And yeah, so these are just some additional points of detail. فَاتِّبَاعٌ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَأَدَاءٌ إِلَيْهِ بِإِحْسَانٍ. The term ittiba' refers to the heir's acceptance of payments or to pursuing them in a reasonable manner according to customary amounts. Some said that both the verbs ittiba' and ada' describe the duty of the killer to follow up with the demand and to deliver payments promptly. So that's the various views. For Ibn Taymiyyah, the payments are made from one tribe to the other based on whichever has suffered the most quote-unquote expensive losses, not based on a specific case to an heir. So then ilayhi, for me, becomes less clear because, it would imply, you deliver it to that brother, that representative of the tribe. But that can work. ذلك تخفيف من ربكم ورحمة. Most of the scholars understand this to mean the lightening, which is the permission to pardon and to be pardoned. Because, as they say in Jewish law, that was not allowed. And so this is something which is takhfif in the Sharia. Right. For Ibn Taymiyyah, all of this is a takhfif. It concerns the bloodwit, and therefore both sides are saved from giving up more of their living members of the tribe. A note which is definitely from me, it also lifted the hardship of identifying. So if there's widespread killing, it's very difficult to identify who exactly killed whom, and trying to exact justice in this very particular and detailed way would have been difficult on both sides. So that's another hardship that is lifted. فَمَنْ اعْتَدَى بَعْدَ ذَلِكَ فَلَهُ عَذَابٌ أَلِيمٌ. Any further killing or refusal is a violation of these terms, and عَذَابٌ أَلِيمٌ is the hereafter, some said, in this life, in the following way. After this is settled, Ibn Taymiyyah says there are to be no more demands by one tribe of the other for money or blood. And another way to read this, as I suggest, is that, whoever then does this kind of killing, between tribes, then he will be severely punished. Don't engage in this kind of conflict again. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving you the means of resolution between, whether it be the Aus and the Khazraj or any two tribes from amongst the believers. He's giving you a way out. And so don't go and do this again. Let this be the end of such awful behavior. So let's come now to beyond the table, to some points of conclusion. So here's where I make my arguments for tarjih. It's where I say, what is it that would recommend one view over the other? So, especially the alternative. Neither of, in this case nor the next case, is there strength in numbers. We cannot say this is the majority view. No, it's very much the minority view. No doubt about that. But I do argue they have strength of clarity. So all those detailed arguments is what we've just encountered in the table. Right? In both our case studies, ijma' is brought up and is relevant. Ibn Taymiyyah has not received that kind of criticism as far as I know, because, as I pointed out already, his view has been mostly not noted, or it's been ignored. He is not someone who's afraid of going against ijma', I think, but in any case, he sees this view as one of two views that existed amongst the Salaf. He presents it that way, and he has reason to present it that way. Therefore, what's interesting is that Hindi, in his book Ikhtiyarat ibn Taymiyyah, he goes to the extent of saying, well, this is not shadh view. It might look shadh, but it's not shadh. Why? Because it has some precedent among the Salaf. So actually, I had a a working title for this in my mind. Originally, I was going to write this as two separate articles. The first article was going to be called "It's Not Shadh When It's Shaykh al-Islam." So it's almost like Hindi's argument is, well, Ibn Taymiyyah could have possibly have said something that's shadh. But the argument actually is there, that it has precedence. So it's hard to dismiss it quite as easily as, let's say, the next opinion where, this seems to pop up with Abū Muslim al-Iṣfahānī and doesn't have anyone before him who said the same. So the stakes here are not so high. The rulings of Qisas are not affected because Ibn Taymiyyah still recognizes that the rulings of retaliation exist, just not by the direct statement of this ayah. How about contextual factors? The placement of this verse within the surah. This is something that, I benefited from insights of Nu'man Ali Khan, Sharif Randawa, earlier work that they did in Surah Al-Baqarah, and work that I did with them also subsequently. And we can find that in the book Divine Speech. And there are other articles that give a kind of structural account of the surah. Naveen Rida's book on the surah, the Al-Baqarah crescendo. They tend to recognize that this verse is like the beginning of a new passage or a new section, right? Where now legal prescriptions are being given. Just before that, you have Ayatul Bir, Laysa al-birra an tuwallu wujuhakum, right? So which is general principles, but then it gets into specific laws. And the first of these laws is to do with Qisas. So why would that be the first thing to mention? Why would that be the first thing? Well, the most important hukum that has to be given to the Muslim community. So I think that Ibn Taymiyyah's view helps to make that the rationale of that, or the wisdom of that, let's say, clearer, the divine wisdom. The opening of our present verse with Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu should be seen in the context of establishing the Muslim identity, and within this surah as successors to Ahlul Kitab, the formation of society according to the laws and principles of new revelation. So, and this is a subtler point here, which you can ponder on in your own time. So the alternative regime becomes more compelling in the light of this structural historical context. Before legislating for new issues, it was important to draw a line under bloody disputes of the past. So the warring tribes were commanded to settle their accounts, and this is a clearer rationale for this being the opening to the legislative section than any I have personally encountered. Historical narrations, as we said, there are historical narrations which indicate that the Prophet ﷺ did not only understand it this way, but implement it in this way. And, people can do the comparison between those reports and the other reports, which give another view of what the ayah was actually about. But I think that they are actually complementary reports. Finally, it should be noted how much clearer this reading makes the phrase, there is life for you in Qisas. Yes, generally this is taken to talk about the deterrent effect of Qisas, but an even clearer meaning is that this Qisas understood in this way, has got life, a saving of life immediately, right? But the long-term meaning remains applicable. So that concludes our tour of the first case study, and then we come on to the second case study, which is Ibrahim and the birds. So here with the ayah 260 of Surah Al-Baqarah, وَإِذْ قَالَ إِبْرَاهِيمُ رَبِّي أَرِنِي كَيْفَ تُحْيِي الْمَوْتَى قال أولم تؤمن قال بلى ولكن ليطمئن قلبي. Right? So there's lots of discussion around aspects of this ayah, but I don't get into all of those discussions, about is this doubt on the part of Ibrahim, and is it allowed for a prophet to have any kind of doubt, or what alternative ways can we understand it? That's all very important and interesting, but not the point of discussion. The point of discussion is here what he is told to do. قال فخذ أربعة من الطير فصرهن إليك ثم اجعل على كل جبل منهن جزءا ثم ادعهن يأتينك سعيا وَاعْلَمْ أَنَّ اللَّهَ عَزِيزٌ حَكِيمٌ. So this translation here is that of Marmaduke Pickthall, and Pickthall's translation is vague enough that it could be understood in both ways. The common way, the mainstream way, the majority way is to say, place a part of them on each hill means kill them, chop them up, and then place bits of them, right? Bits of the remains of those birds on various hills, right? But there are other translations that don't accommodate both. There are some translations which are clearly on one side or the other. So we'll see some of that. So there's no word here of chop or cut. So maybe Pickthall wanted to leave it open to that, or maybe he inclined towards the alternative view, but he doesn't leave us footnotes that tell us what he understood here. So the alternative interpretation, the earliest mention of this we have, and then subsequent people always tell us that is his view, is Abū Muslim al-Iṣfahānī, Muhammad ibn Bahr. We saw his quote right in the beginning about that there are idiots amongst people who claim knowledge. But his tafsir, we often find it in al-Razi's work. And it's just, he's always has very interesting points of view. He's courageous in his readiness to differ from others. One of the things that is frequent with him is that he disagrees with naskh or abrogation. Therefore, under every ayah where there is a claim of abrogation, he would give you an alternative view, and Al-Razi would mention that alternative view, and sometimes he agrees with that alternative, says, well, this is not a case of naskh in fact, and Abū Muslim is right. In other cases, he would say, well, Abū Muslim is not right here. So this is not about abrogation, but it's another case where Al-Razi brings up Abū Muslim's view and seems to disagree with it, but I'm not so sure that he does, in fact, as I'll try to show you. So before Al-Razi, there's actually somebody else who mentions Abū Muslim, and this commentary was only recently published, so we wouldn't have known, and other people who are quoting Abū Muslim would always have gone via Razi and not through Al-Hakim al-Jishumi. So this footnote is not too important to us just now. But what's interesting is that Abū Muslim's view has been characterized by at least one scholar, Muhammad Abu Zahra, in the 20th century, as being almost like he's saying it's the Zahir reading of it. It's based upon the wording with no attention to context. And he's saying that as a criticism, right? Now, most people criticizing Abū Muslim will say, هذا خلاف الظاهر جدا. This is so far away from what's apparent in the verse. Whereas Abu Zahra is saying, no, it's what's wrong with it is that it's based upon the wording, and he hasn't thought enough about context. I can make this bigger, I think. Yeah, there we go. Oh, okay. So we'll come back to where we were. So Al-Jishumi tells us that the people of Tafsir before him, and he's in the 5th century Hijri, the people of exegesis are unanimous that the verse means cut them up, and that Ibrahim did chop and mix them. And then he says, Sirhunna. We have two readings here. And I discussed the two readings a bit more in more detail later on. But here I just point out that, okay, we can't be quite sure even which one Al-Hakim al-Jishumi is intending. Is he saying Sirhunna and then As-Sayr, which are related, or was he saying Surhunna and As-Sawr, as some manuscripts give us? And this is what we call hafsonormativity. The printed edition of Al-Jishumi's Tafsir tells us that that the edition has adopted the narration of Hafs and Asim simply because it is the dominant one today, even though Al-Hakim al-Jishumi was most likely using Qalun, right? Which in any case would be Surhunna, I think. Anyway, Sirhunna, because in the printed edition we've got a Sayr, so I put Sirhunna here. Means make them inclined to you. Amilhunna ilayk. As-Sayr means to make incline and train to respond. I make them accustomed to being called and responding to you. Then place on each mountain a portion of them means one of the 4 birds. So this is a point where again and again people will tell you this is khilaf al-Zahir, to call one bird a juz is not convincing at all. Well, I think that, as I hope that one would agree with me upon reflection and looking at the arguments made, it's actually very natural to call one bird a juz. It's nothing There's nothing particularly strange about that or problematic. But then call them and they will come to you. God draws attention to his power to do all things. If it meant that they should be chopped up, he would have said, Sirhunna, without ilayka. Because there is a view that sirhunna or surhunna, that this verb means to cut. Okay? But so what he's telling you, Abū Muslim is telling you, that the word ilayka takes it away from the possibility of meaning that. So there it must mean incline, to incline them to you, to bend them to you, bend them to your will. Al-Hakim al-Jishmi, who is Mu'tazili as well, both of them Mu'tazili, he says this is unacceptable, this is fasid, due to the consensus of the exegetes to the contrary. That's the first argument is, well, first of all, who are you to come up with this view? And secondly, he gives a reasoning, because Abraham wanted God to show him how he gives life to the dead. And what Abū Muslim mentioned is not particular to Abraham. So in short, he understands that there needs to be some kind of miraculous occurrence in this verse. And that is the general point of view that has stuck in the minds of most readers of the Quran and Mufassirin, in our tradition. But that's a point that I'm going to question again and again, as others have questioned before me, right? So what is it that makes us think that there has to be something particular to Abraham here, or something miraculous that couldn't happen with anyone else? Instead, for Abū Muslim, this is something which is meaningful for everyone who reads the ayah. We don't have to witness what Ibrahim witnessed to reach the comfort of that explanation and response that was given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I talk about how this is presented in Ar-Razi. The purpose was to mention a tangible example for the life spirits returning to the bodies. So this is a presentation of this view. So this is Ar-Razi's presentation of Abū Muslim's view, right? He quotes several arguments made by Abū Muslim, and then he gives a response. So he mentions that some have given this an answer concerning ilayka, and then Abū Muslim's got responses to that as well, right? So we'll see that in more depth when we come to the table, inshallah. And then there's a list of arguments Ar-Razi presents that were made in support of the mashhur position, first of which is consensus. So these points, this might sound like a very simple conclusion in a way, but it's based on quite a bit of sleuthing, I would say. Maybe one day it will become common knowledge or accepted wisdom. But I believe that Ar-Razi is actually quoting those points against Abū Muslim from Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar. So we don't have Abdul Jabbar's tafsir, but one can detect that Ar-Razi is making extensive use of it. And here I think that he's quoting Abū Muslim from Abdul Jabbar, and he's quoting Abdul Jabbar's responses to Abū Muslim as well. But he doesn't mention Abdul Jabbar's name at this point. Later on, he does say something about Al-Qadi under the same verse, but not at this point. So later on, people have thought that these are Ar-Razi's points, but actually they are somebody else's points, probably Abdul Jabbar's. And that tells you something about this opinion. It's not a Mu'tazili opinion as such. It's not all the Mu'tazila are of this view. Only Abū Muslim. So Al-Jishmi disagrees, Abdul Jabbar disagrees, and Zamakhshari doesn't even mention Abū Muslim's view. So calling it Mu'tazili is not very meaningful. So I say that Ar-Razi did not make his own stance explicit. So you can certainly suppose that by mentioning those arguments and not coming back at them again, that's his final word and he accepts Abdul Jabbar's points. Maybe, but not certainly. Then there has been little engagement with this opinion until the 19th century. There has been some, though. Here it's mentioned. Safadi, whose commentary is a very unusual one, Kashf al-Asrar, and it has just been recently published. So Not much has been said about it, so this is one of the, I guess, one of the first things, one of the few things that's been written about it, even tangentially and in the footnote, particularly in the English language. So he talks about Abū Muslim's view with a slightly different take on it. And it's also mentioned in Bahr al-Muhit of Abu Hayyan, Gharaib, the Gharaib of Nisapuri, the Lubab of Ibn Adil, and there are some others that may have mentioned it, but pretty much that's it. Again, using the Jami' Tarihi to try to find every mention that I could. So, Al-Alusi, whom I love, is from the 19th century, a masterful mufassir, he poured fresh opprobrium, right? Harsh criticism on Abū Muslim's stance. Again, against consensus is the first thing that's mentioned. And then he says that it conflicts with the apparent sense of the verse. He says it conflicts with authentic reports. He doesn't tell us what those authentic reports are. And then he says, and all that for no purpose at all. So as I say, that's a bit harsh, but also, I don't want to use the word lazy or something, but I would have hoped for a bit more effort to try to determine what the purpose was of Abū Muslim's alternative, because I think it was very purposeful indeed, very meaningful indeed. So he was unwilling to consider the positive features and effects of this alternative view, which is what I'm spelling out in this paper. And others like Rashid Rida have done so at the turn of the 20th century. So here I talk about the reports, right? So Alusi only mentions a few things, but he doesn't show how these contradict Abū Muslim's view or why they are binding upon a mufassir, right? Only one of these reports has direct bearing on the issue. And then I talk here about if we look at Mawsu'at Tafsīr al-Ma'thūr of Musa'ad al-Tayyar and his team, there are 110 narrations pertaining to the verse as a whole, right? The whole of verse 260. So what I've done here is present some general observations regarding these materials. So this is a very important footnote, I guess, especially for Muslim readers, because within the journal readership, there might be many people who are not that bothered about what does it say in our Ma'thūr works or from the Salaf. But of course, amongst Muslims, this has more significance. So I don't want us to feel that, I've completely neglected that. It's just that it really isn't as significant as some might suggest. If we look at the narration, so I went through the whole 110 in the Mawsu'ah. There are narrations which have Ibrahim a.s. wondering how God could bring back all the parts together after being consumed by different animals. Some suggest that he was asking for confirmation, not of the dead being brought back to life, but of his status as God's intimate friend, or that the hardship he faced from his people would be lifted. So these are some things that have come up in some of the commentaries, so they have some basis in early opinions as well. Second, while most of the narrated exegesis of surhunna explains that it means chop, shaqiqhunna, qatta'hunna, mazziqhunna, it may be that these glosses, and sometimes these meanings are ascribed to, that surhunna comes from the Nabati language or the Habashi language. It was needed precisely because the other meanings were more obvious. So the fact that they're telling you that surhunna means shaqiq and mazziq and so on, and that you have to appeal to another language or dialect, is because the normal Arabic reader would see surhunna as meaning amilhunna, etc. Right? So that's a subtle argument. It's an academic argument. Hopefully you get the idea of what I'm saying. Third, a group of narrations describe this as a mathal, which God presented to Abraham. This depends on ascribing the bird's revival to Abraham, so he would grasp by analogy how God will gather and raise the dead from every direction and distance. So what I'm saying is that it's a fascinating collection of narrations, but it's not giving like one clear narrative, and it is also some of the narrations are quite problematic in terms of the mainstream interpretation, right? Describing as a mathal is closer to Abū Muslim's view, in fact, than it is to the mainstream view, right? So just keep that in mind. وَلَا تَغْفَلْ. So then we come to the turn of the 20th century, okay? And here's where a lot happens in the footnotes, that anyone who's not reading the footnotes or not reading the endnotes would not even notice a lot of the detail that went into the research here. But there's a certain reason why I've kept certain things above the line and some things below the line. So I've said that several commentaries produced in the Indus subcontinent adopted Abū Muslim's view, but without naming him. So the reason I put these things in the footnote is because these commentaries don't have a clear lineage to Abū Muslim. So I'm trying to say how this view was carried through time. The fact that in the 20th century some people said the same thing is definitely relevant, but we don't know. Did they get that from the same sources? Did they get it from Abū Muslim? Is it a continuation of Abū Muslim's view, therefore, and an afterlife of his view, or is it something which just happens to correspond? So I'll come to that in a moment, inshallah. The thing that we've got above the line is the first major intervention on his behalf, particularly in the Arabic language, came in Tafsīr al-Manar, where Muhammad Rashid Rida has given a paraphrase of Abū Muslim's view. He's given another ayah which helps us to understand the spirit of this ayah. He turned to the sky which spoke, he said to it and the earth, so come into being willingly or not, and they said we come willingly. So the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls and speaks to things, that's what's being intended in this ayah, where one day Allah will call everything back to him. The maker of all things will call every atom of creation, every body and every soul back to him, and they will come together recognizing their maker. Let me come to that in a moment. He quotes the whole passage from Al-Razi, then counters each of the arguments against Abū Muslim, and then he praises Abū Muslim's view, saying that it's the most evident reading. It's the mutabadir, similar to saying zahir, and it is supported by context. So contrary to what Abu Zahra said a bit later, he said it is both more evident and supported by context, and that's also what I believe. And he praises Abū Muslim's subtle understanding and strong independence. Right. In the footnotes of the edition that I have of Tafsir al-Manar, we've got the editor of some kind has come in and said, this statement of Abū Muslim is tahrif. It conflicts with the context and contradicts the statements of the Salaf. So you see that this view just has haters, at every stage. There's people who want to criticize it, there's people who want to suppress it, who want to delete it, and you'll see that when it comes to the story of translations. By the way, one of the very interesting things that I discovered when I was trying to read Tafsir al-Manar on this verse, and I found there's just a bit that just didn't seem right, and just seemed to jump, and it wasn't clear. The wording wasn't clear. So I went back to the first edition, the PDF of the first edition of Tafsir al-Manar, which also had this same problem. So then I went back to Majallat al-Manar, which is the journal that it's taken from, and found that the original text has 4 lines which got clipped out of the first edition and then subsequent editions. So this editor is very busy with this whole oh, this is against the Salaf, but he wasn't busy in saying, okay, something wrong with this text, let me see if I can fix it. And I managed to fix it, alhamdulillah. And in the missing bit, and I assume this is done by error, right? I don't see any reason that this would have been missed out on purpose. It's just it got clipped out, and then one of Rashid Rida's strongest arguments got missed, which is to say, regarding the juz, he says a juz of a group is one individual. That is, a part of a group is one individual. It's a member of the group. And a juz of an individual is a piece, right? So a juz of a bird is its leg or its wing or its head or its beak, whatever. But the juz of 4 birds is one bird. And in fact, there are some ayat of the Quran which help to support this point. Inshallah, we'll come to that. He then says it's strange that Ar-Razi, as he thinks it's Ar-Razi who is providing the arguments, why does Ar-Razi think that ijma' is relevant? What's ijma' got to do with it? وَكَمْ مِنْ آيَةٍ فَهِمَ الرَّازِي خِلَافَ كَذَا وَكَذَا, right? There are many verses which Ar-Razi and others understood differently from all preceding exegetes. So that's the bit where it joins on to what is actually in the printed text. So, faida inshallah. Right. Now, let's see who else had this view in the turn of the century. This is where I've got some quite major footnotes. The first of these was Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. Now, as you probably know, this is somebody who claimed to be all sorts of things. He claimed to be the promised Messiah, in other words, the second coming of Jesus, peace be upon him. And therefore, he's not like an ordinary mufassir in the sense of just a scholar who relies upon scholarly arguments and scholarly authority, but he has a different kind of authority for his followers. And I've had some discussions with colleagues and people from this group to try to understand better how they see it. I don't want to say too much from my own point of view, but in any case, he has advanced this point of view and we can find that in some writings as they are collected, and it would seem that it's the earliest recording of it is about 1903, maybe even earlier. This shorter comment from around 1891. And so this raises a question for me as to, okay, where did he get it from? Was it just his point of view? Was he inspired by someone else saying this before him? Well, not Rashid Rida, because Rashid Rida is slightly later, because his publication was, I think, also 1903 or maybe 1906, that it was published. I think it was 1906. Have I got this here? Yes, April 1906. So it would seem then that Ghulam Ahmad is coming earlier with this view. Now, there were people around Ghulam Ahmad who also were influenced by the kind of intellectual culture of the time, which was what was commonly called modernist and naturalist and so on. So it could be that some of them also were reading Tafsīr al-Razi and encountered it there. We do find a lot of references to Tafsīr al-Razi in works of the Ahmadiyya movement. So it could be from al-Razi, but what's interesting is that he does not attribute it to al-Razi. It could also be, if you were to think about Sayyid Ahmed Khan, for example, that would be one that we can look into. But Sayyid Ahmed Khan actually doesn't take Abū Muslim's view. Sayyid Ahmed Khan reads it in a sort of conventional way, but with the key difference that he sees it as being a vision or like a dream, right? So anyway, I talk here about the history of how this view then proliferated in the works of the Ahmadiyya, from the Qadiani side in particular, and then also the Lahori side is mentioned in some other notes in my paper. So I also point to some issues in this whole generally symbolic interpretation, because what happens is that the son of the founder of that movement, who's known as Bashiruddin Mahmud Ahmad, he describes the standard view as clearly wrong. But he goes on to give not only a view that is not about cutting, but then he provides a completely symbolic reading of the story, such that each bird represents a fallen nation, which then rises. One version of this is that there are 2 times that the Israelites fell and were brought back up, and twice that the Ishmaelites fell and were brought back up. The first of these would be, so this is Moses and Jesus were the 2 getting back up for the Israelites, and then Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and their Mirza Ghulam Ahmad is the 2 times for the Ishmaelites. So he says the final rise is being arranged by God through the Ahmadiyya movement. So, as I point out here in brief, this problematizes really, you're trying to do 2 things with the verse at the same time. Is it about Arini kayfa tuhil mauta, or is it about your movement and your 20th century messianism? right? Is it about Ibrahim or not? It's really, it's difficult to put all of these things into one coherent explanation, and I certainly don't believe that they managed to do so. So that's Mirza Ghulam Muhammad. Now, interestingly, the other one is someone who was a nemesis of Mirza Ghulam. He had very high-profile debates with him. I don't think that's entirely relevant to the point here, but Thanaullah Amr al-Sari, who was a leader of the Ahl Hadith movement, has also had this view, which he puts in his Arabic commentary. It was first published in India in 1902. So, slightly before some of the things from Mirza Ghulam Muhammad, but, maybe after some other mentions of it. In the Urdu translation, it's not mentioned, but the Arabic commentary has the alternative in the main text and relegates the standard view to a footnote. And he says, choose as you please. Amr al-Sari is known for, having some alternative views, and he got a lot of flack for it, and he got into a lot of trouble with his contemporaries, especially from within the Ahl Hadith movement, which is basically a Salafi movement. So he ended up having a lot of discussions and debates and confrontations about it, and in the end, he made some changes and he kept some of the things, and he seems to have won out in the end in a certain way. But his tafsir is not very famous. But it's important to my research because he's using a method of tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran, which is the topic of my PhD thesis and subsequently of my forthcoming book, explaining the Quran through the Quran. So, again, in the Saudi edition of this tafsir, Mubarak Puri, the famous Safiur Rahman Mubarak Puri, writes in the footnote, but the first interpretation chosen by the author does not entail Abraham being shown how God revives the dead. So what is the point in this interpretation? So similar kind of criticisms as made by others. Now, in fact, there is a work which I've been trying to get hold of in full. I've got so far a partial copy. It's called Al-Kalam al-Mubin fi Jawab al-Arba'in, where Thanaullah has responded to his critics on 40 points in his tafsir. One of them is this very verse, and I have read some of what he said there, but some of it is illegible or lost so far to me. But inshallah, when I get it in full, I'm planning to publish this because it's very interesting the extent to which he makes this argument. It's possibly as extensive as Rashid Rida's argument for it. So even I might like to put the two together. That's an idea that I'm having as I'm talking to you, to publish Rashid Rida's commentary with the missing 4 lines and Thanaullah's commentary. But the thing is, his is in Urdu, so it might be nice to translate both of them also to English. Right. So this view, after having been brought back to the surface by Rashid Rida, then received more criticism. I talk here about Tabatabai and also Shirazi and his team, who have given quite detailed responses to Rida's arguments. So I can talk in the table format about some of these arguments, and how these various arguments countered each other as well. Let's come now to talk about translations. So they have their own story. Of course, there were translations done by Orientalists before the 20th century. All of them have a version of Qattam, right? And it could be that they're basing that on Tafsīr, right? Because if they weren't basing on Tafsīr, I'm not sure that they would have landed upon the view of cutting. But they could well have done so based on looking at Genesis 15. And we're going to come to this. Genesis 15 hardly bears resemblance to this ayah. But there is in it Abraham, some animals, and some cutting. So it could be that if they linked it to Genesis 15, that they would have also come up with this cutting interpretation. Quran Archive, Quran-archive.org is a very useful website for this, to see the first editions of these things. And even as I've said here, you can find on this other website, Quran12to21.org, Orientalist translations into non-English languages, which have the same cutting uniformly, right? So then when it comes to the 20th century, now Muslims start to translate, and then you have also, in the earliest translations, it's actually done by the Ahmadiyya translators, and then Sunni Muslims, mainstream Muslims have adopted translation a little bit later. So the vast majority adhere to the standard view, often explicitly, about cutting. Sometimes it's ambiguous and the footnote explains which way they are going, and some do not specify, as we saw with Pickthall. So then here's the mention of a little bit above the line about Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, because now it pertains to translation as well. 1905, Muhammad Abdul Hakim Khan, Lord said, take 4 birds and tame them to myself, then place each one of them on a hill. So this is an explicitly non-cutting interpretation. So I talk here about some of the background about this movement. And then the very influential translation of Muhammad Ali, who had split off and was one of the founders of the Lahori movement, which did not recognize the prophethood of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, but they still recognize him as the Messiah, etc. Right? Anyway, the official Qadiani rendering, that is to say, of the majority branch, Qadiani branch of the Ahmadiyya, also has this similar non-cutting version. Right? I haven't given that here in the text. Later, a number of Muslim translators not belonging to that movement adopted Abū Muslim's view explicitly. Of course, I'm not in this, saying that I believe that the Ahmadiyya are within the bracket of Muslims, but in academic context, this is a way that we would word this point. Muhammad Asad has, take then 4 birds and teach them to obey thee, then place them separately on every hill around thee. Place them separately. This is Muhammad Asad. And he says that this is following the primary meaning of Surah Hunna, and he quotes Abū Muslim via al-Razi. Muhammad Abdul Halim, my supervisor and mentor, also has then placed them on separate hilltops. So he's not believing in the chopping view. However, his footnote doesn't make the distinction clear, because he says that the other view is then place them separately on hilltops. Well, the alternative view is chop them, then place their pieces, right? So that's not clear here. But again, Abū Muslim via al-Razi, and Professor Abdul Halim, Hafidhahullah, is a big fan of al-Razi, by the way. But as we saw, al-Razi doesn't seem to be siding with Abū Muslim here. The study Quran translation is vague, but in the note, they make clear that they want it to be read with the alternative view. Here, this is Janur Dali. Right. A very interesting case. We're almost at the table now and the conclusions, inshallah. A very interesting case is Abdullah Yusuf Ali. So in 1934, he published his translation from 1934 to 38. And his wording was, tame them to turn to thee, put a portion of them on every hill. And he says in the footnote that this is in contrast to the position of the received commentators. He says that he has read Hafiz Ghulam Sarwar and Maulvi Muhammad Ali, right, who we mentioned from the Lahore Ahmadiyya. And he says that this alternative commends itself as a natural reading of Surah Hunna, right? But in subsequent versions of it, in particular in the 1980s, the King Fahd complex in Riyadh adapted his translation. There they ended up with this very strange translation. Tie them, brackets, cut them into pieces, then put a portion of them on every hill. So Surah Hunna, this meaning of Surah Hunna, I found some support for it because there's a report from Ibn Abbas that it means awthiq hunna. But it's not the normal understanding of Surah Hunna. There are 2 understandings of Surah Hunna, either incline them or cut them. Here they've made it tie them, and then they put in brackets, cut them into pieces, which is, there should be maybe a comma here, tie them, and then cut them into pieces, and then put a portion of them. Anyway, this translation is not Yusuf Ali. That's what we have to know. And it's not Yusuf Ali 1987, because Yusuf Ali has nothing to do with anything that happened in 97. He died in the 1950s, right? So to say Yusuf Ali 1987 is wrong, of course. It is the King Fahd complex translation. For the most part, in subsequent editions of Yusuf Ali, we find that they go back to the original wording. But the footnote in which he credits Ghulam Sarwar Muhammad Ali and says that he's taking the alternative view, that footnote has been chopped from the Saudi edition, and it's also chopped in a lot of the later editions. I don't know exactly why, but it means that they were using the Saudi edition probably as a guide to the footnotes, and that's a shame. Of course, there might be some things that we find disagreeable in his original footnotes, but some of the kind of what do you call it? Some of the translations become unintelligible because we lost the footnote that explained why he chose to word it in a particular way. Now, what's extra strange, the real twist in the story, is that if you look up the Yusuf Ali translation on major websites, so currently islamawakened.com and also even Quran.com, which I'm going to get that fixed, inshallah. If you look up the ayah 260, you get something that comes up, which is this: draw them to you and cut their bodies to pieces. That's neither his translation from 1934 nor the 1987 King Fahd translation. So what is it? Someone has stuck this in here and we're not entirely sure who, but it is a translation that is probably taken from N.J. Dawood, a Jewish translator of the Quran. So just be aware that what you find on the internet is not always accurate. Surprise, surprise. So the main thing that I'm trying to draw attention to in that is this verse was a locus for interference because it's frequently been seen that this alternative cannot be accepted. We cannot allow someone to say that it doesn't mean chopping. How dare they? We must remove that and hide it and pretend it didn't happen. And in fact, the same thing happened in the French translation of Muhammad Hamidullah. He had all of this. He had the alternative, and then the King Fahd complex revised his French translation, and they added this gloss, which means cut them. They removed the translator's marginal note, which drew upon Rashid Rida. So this is really a problematic set of practices. I hope you'd agree. Now we come to the table. This is where we get into some detail. The competing perspectives between the majority and the alternative from Abū Muslim. So let's see if I widen this to make this easier to read. So the start of the ayah: وَإِذْ قَالَ إِبْرَاهِيمُ رَبِّي أَرِنِي كَيْفَ تُحْيِي الْمَوْتَى. According to the simplest accounts of the majority understanding, he's asking to witness resurrection with his own eyes. So for the most part, that's how you find the standard tafsir. For this to take place, the birds would have to be dead, so he'd have to kill them before calling them back. So that's why, inserting that kind of what do we say, that inserting that gloss makes sense. However, there's an objection to this. Ibrahim was not asking to be reassured that God can revive the dead, but he was asking to be shown how. And in the standard understanding, he's to put them on mountains, and then they're going to come back to life over there on the mountains. And by the time they reach his hands, they're already alive. So what has he actually seen? Has he seen them coming back to life? No. He's just seen that they have come back to life. He's seen that I saw these dead earlier, and now I can see that they're alive again, so I believe that God has brought them back to life. This is not arini kaifa. Show me how. So, those on behalf of the standard view may respond like this, and they have responded like this. What's happening here is that Ibrahim is being put in the position of the resurrector. He is calling them back as if he is bringing them back to life. So by getting that feeling of being the resurrector, he now understands how God brings them back to life. I won't go into my feelings about this, but I don't find it convincing. I don't find that that answers the objection. And it brings up some other problems, you know, of putting someone in the position of the divine attribute. So the counter to this, there's necessarily a gap between how God performs an act and how a created being carries it out, even with power granted to him. And presumably I came across this counter somewhere because I haven't attributed it to myself. Right. Abū Muslim's view. It's often characterized as being based on the ira'a, you know, show me. The ru'ya, the seeing, is to do with intellectual seeing, to demonstrate intellectually. So seeing is understanding, and the request may be understood that it equates to clear vision. Right? Give me clear vision and clear understanding of how you bring the dead back to life. So in Surah Al-An'am, thus did we show Ibrahim, وَكَذَلِكَ نُرِي, and in fact, it's in the present tense. Thus we show Ibrahim. كَذَلِكَ نُرِي Ibrahim. Thus we show Ibrahim the dominion of the heavens and the earth. So this could be one of those showing, right? Not through a physical showing, but through demonstration. Because then the rest of the passage in Surah Al-An'am also has this intellectual argument which he gives to his people. وَتِلْكَ حُجَّتُنَا آتَيْنَاهَا إِبْرَاهِيمَ عَلَى قَوْمِهِ. So then he shows them, look, if I said that this star or this planet is my Lord, then it sets, and then this moon is my Lord, and then it sets, and the sun is my Lord, then it sets. So he's showing people that none of these things can be Lord. So that's a very useful parallel to ponder upon. Objection to Abū Muslim's view. Ibrahim already believed with certainty but wanted to observe it physically. So that's what should be happening in this ayah. Right? A rational proof is not enough. You know, sometimes people are convinced of something rationally, but they want to see it with their own eyes. That's how you really believe in something. This is an objection that is given and an argument that's made by several mufassirin, including the likes of Tabatabai and so on. So the response here is from me. That's SS, that's me. The sense of seeing how, arini kaifa, as I've kind of argued already here, corresponds better to the sense of understanding than seeing that. Right? So showing me that you bring it to life is arini annaka tuhil mauta, or arini ihya'aka al-mauta, right? But here arini kaifa, the kaifa is something which is more an intellectual attribute, I would argue. And it also differs from saying explain how. He's asking for something which is akin to seeing, right? The response therefore should involve imagery and not necessarily physical seeing, right? So I hope these points are having some impact on you so far, right? It gets better, inshallah. It gets better, right? So then, قال أولم تؤمن. This section, as I've said earlier, has got a lot of discussion amongst the mufassirin, but that's not really relevant to what we are talking about because it doesn't affect which way you go, left or right. قال فخذ أربعة من الطير. Right, what's going on here? Okay, so here in the footnote I discuss about how the discussion in the Tafsīr is about you know, which four birds and whether that has symbolic meaning, and Baydawi talks about that, and then it's elaborated in some of the hashis on Baydawi. So it's all very fascinating, but quite strange in my personal view, because, you know, first of all, you know, if there were any relevance to the identity of the birds, then, you know, our Lord would have provided us that information without it being through some weak narrations here and there. And as I said here, that Al-Baydawi takes these as spiritual allusions rather than the primary meaning of the text. But as I said earlier about symbolic readings, they compete with the central point regarding certainty about revival of bodies and souls. Moreover, the point is that he says that they are representing vices, evils, flaws within your soul which you have to kill. In that case, then what is the bringing them back to life supposed to be about, right? So I don't really understand exactly what is being argued. And of course, I'm just a very, very miskeen person, and he is al-Imam al-Qadi al-Baydawi, rahimahullah. So perhaps my criticism is not in the right place, but I welcome any elaboration and clarification of his point of view. Right, in the majority interpretation, خُذْ أَرْبَعَةً مِنَ الطَّيْرِ is an actual instruction. Go ahead and take them. That is the Zahir. Granted. God has accepted Abraham's request. He's explaining how it will be fulfilled. Go ahead now. Take 4 birds. And then you would probably understand that he actually went ahead and did this because he's been told to do it. So of course he would do it, right? Some entertain the possibility that even though they maintain the standard view of the ayah as a whole, they entertain the view that maybe he didn't have to actually do it because maybe the explaining of what would happen was enough. So that brings it kind of closer to Abū Muslim's view in a particular respect. It may have done its work without being witnessed directly. So the objection to the majority view is the same could be achieved by chopping 1 bird. What's it got to do with 4 birds? Why put it away on mountains? What's that got to do with anything? Response to that objection. These aspects demonstrate the extent of God's power. Birds may be different species, symbolism, the fact that there's multiple birds and then mixing up their remains, none of which is mentioned in the ayah, by the way, nothing about mixing up remains. So all of these things are just understood or in a way superimposed onto the ayah. And then putting them far away, they can come from far away. It demonstrates the extent of God's power. Perhaps. Right, so the alternative view, it could be a command which Ibrahim would carry out. Actually go and take 4 birds, train them, get them to recognize you, be familiar with you, then go and deliver them onto mountains, then leave them there and come back. That's possible. It does kind of raise a question of how do you put a live bird onto a mountain? That would be another kind of objection I think I didn't mention here. But that's why perhaps it works better as a demonstration. Practically, it would be quite difficult to put a live bird on a mountain and leave it there. Don't follow me back. Okay, stay here. It's quite difficult. But as a conceptual placing on a mountain and imagining it being done, that's perfectly fine. So that's how it's generally been understood. The instructions were given by way of explanation, like a thought experiment. That's a nice modern way of putting it. That is to say, if you want to visualize it, فَخُذْ. If you want to visualize it, then imagine that you take 4 birds. And that would be, that would impact on the type of fa that's understood here. This could be compared with the rhetorical imperative. I think this is from me, I put some of my own arguments here without always pointing out that they're from me. In some ayat we have قُلْ كُونُوا حِجَارَةً أَوْ حَدِيدًا. They're saying, would we be raised up after we've turned to dust? Well, go ahead and be stone. Go ahead and be iron. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will still raise you back up. So of course, that's not an instruction and it's not even a creative command. Allah is not turning anyone into stone and iron by saying this, but rather is it, if you want to understand, then go ahead. Like if you were to even become stone or become iron, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will still bring you back things that you might consider to be hard or difficult to reassemble after being crumbled to nothing. It is also possible in this view to understand that the response فَخُذْ أَرْبَعَةً مِنَ الطَّيْرِ was not matching the request as such, because understanding the ways of God is impossible. So it's almost to say the closest that you can get to understanding this is to take 4 birds. And we'll see from below, Rashid Rida also brought up the ayah in which Musa alayhi salam has said, وَإِذْ قَالَ مُوسَى ربي أرني أرني أنظر إليك أرني أنظر إليك, which is literally show me so I may look upon you, right? So then in that whole passage where Musa is told you will not see me, right? By the way, these are the only two arinis in the Quran. I just double checked. ولما جاء موسى لميقاتنا وكلمه ربه قال ربي أرني أنظر إليك, verse 143 of Al-Araf. So he says, let me look upon you. And then he's shown through what happened after that, that you cannot look upon me, certainly in this world. But the closest you can get is to look at the effect that manifesting my glory upon this mountain has upon that mountain, and how it collapses, and how Musa himself collapses. Are you starting to see how profound this is? Inshallah. فَصُرْهُنَّ إِلَيْكَ. There are two opinions. I alluded to this earlier, but here it's spelled out in a bit more depth regarding the word surhunna, sirhunna, right? I'll come to the qira'at issue in a moment. Either it is instruction to incline them, which means amilhunna, or it's an instruction to chop them, qatti'hunna, right? So generally the Mufassirin will say those are two meanings of the word itself, right? So Mufassirin accept these two possibilities. The majority accept the two possibilities, but either they understand the word to mean chop, or they read the chopping into, just is implicit in the verse. So the idea is Ibrahim must, of course we have the other qira'ah, Ibrahim must familiarize himself with the birds, so he will recognize them when they return to him. Thus one must read as implied an additional instruction to kill them, chop them up, and mix their remains. So I'm trying to say, look, that's not as zahir as people tell us, all of this implication, kill them, chop them up, and mix their remains. That's actually three things when you think about it, right? And then place them on the mountain. However, if you read it as قَطِّعْهُنَّ, chop them, then part of that instruction is explicit and not implicit. Objection to this, and this is Abū Muslim's objection, right? As quoted in Razi, فَصُرْهُنَّ إِلَيْكَ means that it cannot mean chop them, because would chop them to you? What would that even mean? Now the response that's given to this is that it's by way of tadmeen, and I talk about verbal embedding here. A verb is coupled with the particle which normally accompanies a different verb. In this way, the latter is implied alongside the explicit verb. That's the definition, but basically, it means that surhunna, incline them towards you and chop them. Sort of both things are implied. The surhunna is actually inclining. Surhunna is chopping, but the ilayka is implying the inclining, right? So it's awkward, right? If you're convinced by it, that's fine. But my point is that's certainly not self-evident, obvious, zahir, and the rest of it, right? Another way that they've explained it is to say the ilayka is actually relating not to surhunna, but khudh. فَخُذْ إِلَيْكَ أَرْبَعَةً مِّنَ الطَّيْرِ فَصُرْهُنَّ أي فَقَطِّعْهُنَّ. But again, these involve inversion of phrases and events, certainly not obvious. Abū Muslim, he rules out the meaning of cut because of ilayka. So the sense of imala, or inclining them to you, it is made clearer upon Abū Muslim's view, because in the standard view, the idea is Ibrahim must familiarize himself with the birds so he will recognize them, right? So it's almost like saying incline yourself to them, make yourself familiar with them. In Abū Muslim's view, it is make them familiar with you, incline them to you. Do you see how this is clearer? I've done the mistake of clicking the wrong thing, so that I'll suffer for that later. Right? So they will be familiar with him and come rushing back upon his call, illustrating how every atom of creation recognizes and responds to its maker. This is the beauty and the purpose and the point behind this view, as some people like Al-Alusi and Mubarak Puri saying, what is the point of this view? It's very pointy indeed. Now here's where I get a little bit deep, a little bit psychedelic in my thought process. And this is where my paper is making an original contribution and a new direction actually in the argument. So the fact that surhunna does not come in any other ayah should be pondered. So the reader of the Quran is not supposed to be absolutely sure that surhunna means either one or the other, because the fact that it is quite ambiguous could be very much the point. The fact that it means one and can mean the other can be intended. Why? To indicate that, yes, it means that incline them to you, but even if you chop them, even if you were to chop them, they would come flying back. That is what I call meaningful ambiguity. Ambiguity which is actually making a point all by itself, right? So fasurhunna ilayk primarily means incline them to you, make them recognize you. But the fact that it kind of sounds like it means chopping, or according to some interpretations of the word, or according to some dialects of Nabati or Habashi, means cut. Well, yes, you know what? Even if you were to chop them, they would still come flying back to you. And that would be a clearly miraculous event, as opposed to the sort of naturally understood event that, birds that you trained would come back to you, right? Here's another psychedelic thought. The word sawr, surhunna ilayk, evokes a connection to the act of tasweer, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-musawwir. He fashions things upon their images. And therefore, when he calls them back, they will reform according to their original tasweer. How Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has formed them, they will come back together. Their individual pieces will come back together. And even, subtler, if this means anything, وَنُفِخَ فِي الصُّورِ, the trumpet that calls them back to their original form is called a sur. And personally, I don't think that's like random coincidence or a complete accident or anything of the sort. I think that there's a very subtle connection between this idea of taswir and asur, and also with surhunna or sirhunna in this ayah, particularly if it's surhunna, by the way. Some more things. So the semantic connection between these words in al-Mu'jam al-Ishtiqaqi. So I missed out a point about the readings. This is a lot of depth here, but just to show that we've done the working. Sirhunna is a minority reading. Only amongst the 7 is Hamza, but there are further among the 10 readers. Okay, we can find these attested among the early generations. Generally, they are just understood to be 2 ways of saying the same thing, whatever that thing is, right? So either they both mean incline or they both mean chop, but sometimes one is seen as more meaning one rather than the other, and the other is taken to mean the other. None of the last couple of sentences I said make any sense, but I'm fasting, and inshallah you forgive me for that, right? So they've also talked about the possibility of it being a loan word from Aramaic or Syriac, and we can find that also in some of the sources of those languages, right? And then we come to ثُمَّ جَعَلَ عَلَى كُلِّ جَبَلٍ, place on every mountain. So the expression every mountain, what does it mean? كُلِّ جَبَل. Some said every one within your sight. Some said 4 to match the number of birds, or the 4 cardinal directions, and maybe that's why it is 4 birds. Some said 7 mountains. Anyway, none of this can really be known. It could be every mountain if we're talking here about just conceptually, right? If you just imagine, if it's happening in your mind, you could place a piece of that bird on every mountain on the earth. So if we go back to the theory of intended ambiguity, meaningful ambiguity, which I said before, we could reach the subtler meaning, or the hidden meaning, or just the below surface meaning, that they would be gathered even if you chop them into infinitesimal pieces and spread them across all the mountains of the world. Okay, so I fully accept you will not find this in the books of Tafsir. This is building on what the Mufassirin have said to a potential way of understanding the verse upon its subtler and deeper levels. Abū Muslim's view: if the birds were alive, then necessarily kulli jabal means 4 mountains, right? So that is distribute them exhaustively. So it makes sense, ala kulli jabal, it makes sense in the context of you've got 4 birds, so put them on every mountain, meaning 4 mountains. ثم جعل. So there's an argument has been made, we can find it with Tafsir al-Manar, that thumma fits the Abū Muslim's view better because look, you got to train them. It takes some time to train them, and then once they're trained, then later on, that's thumma has tarahi in it, right? Taba'i says, well, no, because chopping and distributing them also takes a long time. Although familiarizing and chopping them together. But then there's another thumma, which they actually, as far as I've seen, don't talk about it at all, which is thumma du'hunna yatina kasa'ya. So here it said maybe it's the period of time in which their remains decompose. That's if we take the standard view, that they are dead. Or the time for them to potentially forget Ibrahim, if we're going with Abū Muslim's view. Wallahu alam. Right. Objection to Abū Muslim's view with a response. It may be impractical, as I said earlier, to leave a live bird upon a mountaintop. However, it may not be intended as a practical instruction, right? Minhunna juz'a. One of my favorite bits, because I myself used to feel that this was the weak point of Abū Muslim's view. And then I came to realize that, you know what, there's nothing weak about it. It's merely due to conditioning that I felt like a juz is a piece. Let's see. It should be noted that a piece from them in the standard view is actually not as zahir as they say, because they don't mean a piece of a bird. What they mean is a portion of the mixture of their remains. صُرْهُنَّ إِلَيْكَ ثُمَّ جَعَلَ كُلِّ جَبَلٍ مِّنْهُنَّ جُزْءًا. Juz here is being taken to mean a portion of the mixture of the remains, and that's not very zahir. Yeah. That's the view that I think requires more justification rather than the other. So, this view that juz can mean an individual bird, actually, Al-Razi, or let's say it is Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar, does say that it is possible that a juz means an individual bird. These ayahs in elsewhere in the Quran, which was cited by Thanaul Amrit Sari and also by Mahmud Ahmad of the Qadiani Ahmadis, they cite these verses. I said both of them cite this one, 1544. Let me open it up so that we can actually see why this is relevant. I generally avoiding opening too many windows, but let's see. So here, لها سبعة أبواب. Let's just look at the, how do we look at the ayah before it? Here we are, okay. وإن جهنم لموعدهم أجمعين لها سبعة أبواب لكل باب منهم جزء مقسوم. Look at the translation. This is, I think, Abdul Halim here. Hell is a promised place for all these, with 7 gates, each gate having its allotted share of them. So the juz here is referring to not one person, but to a portion among the people, right? So given that there are many, many thousands and millions or billions of people, a juz is a certain number or subset from among them, right? So likewise, from 4 birds, a juz is a subset among them. So a juz could refer to 2 birds, it could refer to 3 birds, and it can refer to 1 bird, right? But it doesn't tell you that they have to be chopped up. Juz does not mean, you know, you have to do tajzi'ah of the a'da and limbs and members. It just means they're divided up. And by the way, support Quran.com this Ramadan, inshallah. Right. So, and even if it's not Ramadan, then support Quran.com. Since they are being referred to in the context of an illustrative example, this is comments from me. And this, again, I think, it's a nice addition to what's being said before. Why is the word juz actually appropriate? Why not, for example, ثم جعل كل جبل منهن واحدا, then place one upon each mountain? It could have been something like that. But I think the word juz is intended because it does make you think about pieces and parts, because it does. And that's where I'm saying about meaningful ambiguity, right? There's something about that word that makes you think of pieces, and that adds to the way in which it is effective. Why? These birds are being compared to human body parts. Right? Each bird in a way represents a limb from your body. So actually, that's quite nice. I just thought of it now. 4 birds, maybe like 2 arms, 2 legs, something like that. And the spirits, which will be called together for resurrection. So juz is a way of your mind shifting to strengthen this comparison. At this point, the birds are not being looked at as birds per se, but as fragmented parts of the whole being 4 birds and the part being 1 bird, right? The ambiguity may also be intended in another way. See above re surhunna. And so it's a point that I've made earlier, really. ثم ادعوهن يأتينك سعيا. This is a standard view, told to call them by their names or a sound they recognize, and they'll be reassembled and come running. Sa'yan, some took literally as running, others said rushing. Objection to this view. The common explanation has it that the birds were resurrected on those distant summits, so he did not witness anything. I started by making this point in this table. Okay, but some Mufassirin said that he kept their heads. And so what he did witness was that they came flying back without heads and then joined onto the heads. It could be like that, but again, nothing like this is in the ayah, so this is all speculation. Right? The fact of God's power was demonstrated to him by the return of the whole birds, but that fact was never in doubt. قَالَ بَلَى وَلَكِنْ لِيَطْمَئِنَّ قَلْبِي. So where is the how? Where is the kaifa? So they would give the response is demonstrated by the fact that Abraham was given power to bring the birds back to life by merely uttering a word like God does upon resurrection. Similar point was made earlier. Abū Muslim's view. The pronouns flow better if they all refer to birds rather than pieces of birds. Yeah. Surhunna ilayk, ثم جعل منهن جزءا ثم ادعوهن. So they are birds all the way through this rather than pieces. However, I don't think that's entirely strong. As Tabatabai points out, it's not unreasonable for him to speak to the birds in order to reconstitute them. I think that's reasonable. The birds fly back from their respective positions at haste because they recognize their master, in this case Ibrahim. A conceptual comparison could be made with Moses saying, I hurried to you, my Lord, so you would be pleased. وَعَجِلْتُ إِلَيْكَ رَبِّي لِتَرْضَى. Not entirely sure why I quoted this, but I love that ayah so much. Objection. This is achievable by any bird trainer. This is a hugely common objection, right? Any bird trainer can do this. So why are you saying that this is what happened to Ibrahim? No, what should happen is should be a miracle. Response. The verse need not be read as documenting a miraculous event. Where did you get that it has to be a miracle? Maybe from context. So we'll come back to this point. Who says that it's emphasizing the uniqueness of Ibrahim? Where is that? Where is it indicated to you that that is what the ayah is for and what it has to do? If it is taken as a verbal demonstration, then this meaning lasts for every reader of the Quran, and therefore it's more powerful than just telling us that Ibrahim witnessed something that we cannot witness. So now coming to the last part of the table. وَاعْلَمْ أَنَّ اللَّهَ عَزِيزٌ حَكِيمٌ. So generally in the Tafsīr, not much is said about the reason for these names being given. One way, so I think Alusi says this, is that know that God is able to overturn the laws of nature at any time. That's Aziz. But he does so only according to wisdom. That's Hakim. Right? Rashid Rida makes a point about this by saying In contrast with the previous verse, in which the person came to the town and then he was made to be dead for 100 years and brought back. It was sealed by the man admitting that أن الله على كل شيء قدير. The present one ends with Abraham being told to appreciate the divine attributes of Izzah and Hikmah. So he understands Izzah as supremacy. Rashid Rida. Let me see. Al-Ghalib alladhi la yunal. Supremacy. The difference suggests that the whole verse has a different purpose from the previous verse. The conclusion of this conclusion here, وَأَعْلَمْ أَنَّ اللَّهَ عَزِيزٌ حَكِيمٌ, is a comment on Abraham's question and the nature of the response to the effect. The secrets of God's power are beyond anyone's comprehension, and he operates according to perfect wisdom. So that's quite a nice alternative way of taking it. So as we're coming to the conclusion, I talk again after that table about the reasons for tarjih of this alternative view in particular, right? So here we've got a lot more argument has taken place. A number of exegetes have explained his position, and they've also criticized it and rejected it. And we've seen the kind of arguments that they've made again and again. Appeals to authorities, appeals to majorities, right? The role of consensus in tafsir needs some more thought. I've mentioned a couple of sources to look into that a little bit about the traditional view, or the modern traditional view, if I can put it that way. Here you find that some, like Rashid Rida and also Amrit Sari, Thanaullah Amrit Sari, dismissed that. He says nobody could say that the understanding of one group of people is binding upon others. By the way, Rida and Sanaullah knew each other, so one could be influenced by the other, etc. But they're basically making similar arguments in terms of ijma' and its role or limitation of its role in tafsir. And I don't elaborate on that here, but the fact that subsequent mufassirin have said the same thing as earlier mufassirin is not the same as ijma', where there's an independent sharing of conclusions, right? So if multiple mufassirin really looked into it and made arguments and came to the same conclusion, then they're strengthening each other. But when they're simply repeating what has been said before, it doesn't have the same weight. That's what I argue. I say also here, even if consensus occurs that a verse does have a particular meaning, that's different from saying that it must mean that. If they agree that it must mean this, then that is stronger, of course, than just simply saying, well, this is the opinion that I take and the understanding that I adhere to, right? Just going to squeeze that back. So here we are. While there's much to be said about the theological stakes, they are quite low. What really happens if you adopt this view? You don't suddenly disbelieve in miracles. You don't become a Mu'tazili. As I said, it's not really a Mu'tazili position because most Mu'tazila were against it. It's not modernist because it's not modern. It's been taken by some modernists, sure. Naturalist, materialist. People from these inclinations might well like this view, but it doesn't mean that it's theirs. It doesn't mean that they own it. It doesn't mean you have to agree with their motivations. If there's no miracle here in this ayah, you can still believe in all the other miracles. There's no binding reason that you have to believe this ayah is talking about a miracle, right? Now, a lot of the criticisms or reactions to Abū Muslim is saying, verbal demonstration is not enough. He needs to see it with his own eyes. But look, the Quran itself is a verbal miracle, right? I just paused to allow that to sink in. The Quran itself is a verbal miracle. Are we saying that it's not enough because we have to see the Prophet ﷺ with our own eyes and all the things that he did? Those are the lesser miracles. Whereas the Quran is the supreme miracle of the Prophet ﷺ, and it's verbal. So what happens if we take Abū Muslim's view is that we see that this point that was made to Ibrahim a.s. and then every hearer of the Quran is something that has a lasting effect. Al-Biqa'i talks about this in a slightly different way. Beyond ilm al-yaqeen to reach ayn al-yaqeen, witnessing something directly. Okay. So now I come on to a point which would be of particular interest to a certain type of reader, people who are into intertextuality, into late antique context, into biblical subtext and parallels. And in short, what's happened here is that I looked at Genesis 15. I looked at the secondary literature around it. I looked at the commentaries, classical kind of commentaries, and modern articles as well. And I just felt completely unconvinced that Genesis 15 has anything to do with our ayah. If it has anything to do with it, it's just there's some superficial resemblances. And I say, it invites consideration. The fact that this question is asked, the animals, the birds, number 4. But apart from that, and maybe I should bring up Genesis 15 so that you can actually, let's just take the first translation that's going to come up. So, this is, he'll bring you out of Ur of the Chaldeans, give this land to take possession. Abraham says, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So that's not Arini kayfa tuhil mauta, it's just a question, right? And then the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, a ram. These are not birds, right? Each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. And some understood this as one bird. Some understood it as 2 birds, right? And then Abraham brought all these to him, cut them in 2, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Look how the one thing that was resembling was the birds, and then the opposite thing happens according to the standard view, because the standard view is that those are the ones that are cut. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away, as he was Abram at that point before his name is changed to Abraham. So there it goes on a little bit further, but I hope you can see already that the resemblance is not strong. Those who have referred to that include, of course, many biblical scholars, Orientalists, the translators that I cited earlier. Some of them made explicit that they were looking at Genesis 15 and drawing that parallel. But also even Muhammad Ali, for example, he considers the subject not to be physical resurrection, but the fate of nations. He argues at some length in a footnote that the Genesis account is quite meaningless and only shows that the text here has been tampered with. So that's a different kind of argument from what's made by the various Orientalists. He's saying that the Quran is actually showing that the Bible text, there must be something wrong with it because it's not matching up and not making sense. For him, Abraham's question in the Quran is equivalent to whereby shall I know that I shall inherit? But the Quranic response alone is effective in demonstrating this. And so his view has got the same problems that I talked about earlier about trying to read this symbolically. Jewish commentary reads the bird as representing sometimes Israel, sometimes Rome. I mentioned some of the commentaries. Some in Christian commentaries, it becomes representative of the future spiritual progeny of Abraham. So basically the Christians, as I understand. So in short, I don't find that it says much to us about why we should interpret it one way or the other. I talk here about more in the symbolic readings. So Baydawi we mentioned, the Qadiani, Lahori, Ahmadi explanations, we've just talked about the latter one. And then also Farahi argued that the example of the birds corresponds to the state of the Jews as they were dispersed but would be gathered together by the lamp of prophet. So again, we don't have the elaboration from him. We just have this short mention in the ta'liqat. And that bears some resemblance to some other symbolic readings. Islahi ignores this in his Tadabbur al-Quran. He talks about the live bird's view, but he doesn't say who has that view. It's not clear that Farahi has that clue, but it might be. And then we have Inayatullah Subhani, who I mentioned earlier. He has another alternative. He also sees that doesn't mean chopping. He doesn't mention Abū Muslim. And he believes that it was asking for confirmation of the glad tidings. He was shown that hearts that turn away and deny this call today will come running to it tomorrow. However, there's various problems with his whole reading of it. What exactly is the meaning of the parable? How do you square this symbolic reading with what is supposed to be happening physically in the description? How do the birds correspond to people who had previously rejected Ibrahim? What is meant by placing them on mountains? He doesn't really explain any of that. Yeah, he's welcome to do so in subsequent editions if somebody conveys my points to him. Right. So having abandoned the biblical parallel as being relevant, if it's a parallel at all, let's look at the Quranic context. So some of the commentators actually looked to the two stories before, right? Verses 258 and 259, Ibrahim and Nimrud is the first one, and then the second one is the man. And there's lots of discussion about who is that man. Is it Ezra? Is it Ezekiel? That's not a concern of ours right now, except if it helps us to understand the way that the stories connect and contrast. So both of these stories before refer to God's power to give life and death. The first, with Nimrud, Ibrahim makes a verbal appeal to a natural phenomena, God bringing the sun from the east. The second one involves at least one supernatural occurrence and physical proof. That is to say, the man has been preserved along with his food and drink for a whole century. Right? To this may be added the resurrection of his donkey. Right? So that's a standard interpretation. There is an alternative which says the bones here are not the bones of the donkey, but his own bones. Tafsīr al-Manar has a completely alternative view there, but we won't get into that. So if it's the case that the first verse and the second verse contain some physical proofs and miracles, does that mean that the third verse has to have it as well? Of course not. The idea that it's about miracles or something is not clear at all, or about the uniqueness of Ibrahim. So let's look at how it happens in Tafsīr al-Biqā'i. Al-Biqā'i argues the common thread in this passage is proofs for resurrection, right? So the first with Nimrod is we have a stubborn disbeliever, and then the second one seems to be a skeptic, but he may be a person of faith with some doubts. And then thirdly, a believer. Ibrahim himself with his Lord is a believer who sought full certainty of heart, right? So the majority view, and Al-Biqā'i follows that, Nimrod claims to have power to give life, then Ibrahim was granted some of that power in the third verse, right, in 260. According to the alternative view, Abū Muslim's view, we could say he was only granted deep understanding because that power is God's sole preserve. So 258 is telling us, Rabbi alladhi yuhyi wa yumit, right? So then what does it mean then in 260 that Ibrahim gets the power to do ihya, right? But rather it is God's power, God's sole preserve. That's the point of the earlier verse. We might also argue, and if we combine Al-Biqā'i with Abū Muslim, that there are three kinds of proof in succession. Verse 258 has got a consistent law in creation. Allah brings the sun from the east. And then proof by a miracle. And then the third one is a rational proof. Why could we not see this as three things in succession, three different types of proof, which are therefore complementary? Another subtle connection, and this is stuff from me really, is that, in Allah ya'ti bish-shamsi min al-mashriqi, ya'ti bish-shams, and then the latter incident shows him that resurrection occurs when everything comes back to its master. Ya'tina kasa'ya. So just the echoing of that word connects the meanings. The sun comes because God instructs it to come. Likewise, the birds come to you as you instruct them to come to you. And likewise, all of creation will come to the Lord when he calls them at the resurrection. This correspondence is clear upon Abū Muslim's reading, especially if you posit that they are in reverse chronological. This is, of course, much more speculative or strange. I'm saying, what if it was the case that Ibrahim, in a way, understood this proof first? That's the proof in 260. And then later in his life, he had that encounter with Nimrud, in which he made this point to him, which is in a way based upon that understanding in 260. So it's not impossible for the verses to be not in chronological order. It's actually very easy for that to be the case. So there's more things about passage structure which I don't get into. Finally, comparable passages elsewhere in the Quran. I mentioned here an American scholar, Gabriel Reynolds. He makes a connection to the disciples in Al-Ma'idah. تَطْمَئِنُّ قُلُوبُنَا. So of course, any reference to a word and connection of a word, can be significant. But I think the more significant one is what Rashid Rida quoted. Moses requesting to see God, Arini, show me so I may look upon you. Each time the prophet asked for something that involved direct experience of divinity and was directed to something else, the maximum that could be granted to a human being. For Moses, that was to see God's majesty manifest upon a mountain. For Abraham before him, it was to understand the power of the creative word be. Okay. And Ar-Razi's complaint, although it's not Ar-Razi, but let's say Abdul Jabbar's complaint, that there's nothing special in Abū Muslim's view for Ibrahim, but rather, even Ibrahim could not hope for that direct experience of the secret of creation and life. And I think that's a really quite profound response. So then we come to the conclusion of the paper, where I've just shown how views which come up at some point in exegetical history, they can be overlooked, they can be critiqued, but they still can be transmitted and preserved somehow, and then can become appealing to someone later on. They can be picked up, promoted, and supported by the likes of Ibn Taymiyya or by the likes of Rashid Rida and the various others. So here I give a kind of post hoc explanation of Fights and Flights. The title Fights and Flights is obviously because one of the ayahs is about fights that took place between tribes, and the other one is about flights of birds. So anyway, it's nice to have something rhyming and catchy. But in terms of Mufassirin, some of them take flight and they break free from the orbit of received tradition. They give flight to the alternatives. And sometimes this results in exegetical fights, the debates that are happening here between Rida and then Tabatabai and so on. These examples provide much material for further explanation of tafsir and adjacent genres, including Quran translations, which contain a lot of interesting material and issues going on. And sometimes those translations are amplifying views which hardly are supported in the tafsir genre itself. These terms, Zahir, Ishkal, Ijma', these are things which came up, and we saw that they need some further investigation as to how Mufassirin are using them and how what they're how they're operable in the field of tafsir. Some exegetes were explicit in noting the problems in their explanation of particularly the Qisas verse. And in general, I want to show that you can say both views have strengths and weaknesses which are weighed against each other, rather than saying one is absolute haqq and the one is absolute batil. And this is really where I'm trying to come up with something a bit original as a hermeneutical strategy. More consideration should be given to the possibility that both alternatives are intended on some level, and that ambiguity is not a bug, but rather a feature of the literary construction of the Quran. And I've argued that in the table under the verse 260. So in the Qisas verse, the standard rulings of retaliation can be derived. even if Ibn Taymiyyah's view is right about the primary sense. As for the birds verse, we can say that perhaps the primary view is actually not the mainstream one. The primary view is Abū Muslim's, but the other meaning of chopping up can be understood secondarily and complementarily, by way of saying even if it were chopped up, then God has the power to bring everything back to you, or certainly to Him, as is actually the point of the verse in the first place. It is about resurrection of bodies and souls. So this kind of compromise, combining Abū Muslim's reading with elements from the majority, gives the most fitting solution to puzzles thrown up by some of the ambiguous wording, in my humble opinion. Alternatively, you could say maybe Ibrahim witnessed the physical resurrection of the birds, and that is actually what happened. But the alternative reading allows for this lasting meaning and effect to take place. That's another way you can take it, but it's not the way that I prefer. And then I've pointed out just the importance of the tafsir genre, and trying to also make this point to readers of the Journal of Quranic Studies, some of whom use tafsir extensively, some of whom tend to downplay how useful tafsir can be or how interesting it can be. But tafsir studies is nowadays a field within itself, which is taking its own shape, where people are studying the genre of tafsir in its own right. But what you can see here, of course, is that I've used the genre of tafsir as an important way of getting to sound conclusions about what the Quranic text is saying, not because of the authority of those mufassirin, but because of their expertise. So we benefit from their expertise, but we can also agree and disagree according to what our capabilities allow, and we can add to things that they have said. So this is just the references, and I'll conclude here. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.